What if the person you helped in their darkest hour could change your entire life, but only if they knew who you really were? Grace Sullivan was just trying to do her job. She never imagined that one act of kindness in a dark hospital room would unravel everything she thought she knew about power, courage, and her own worth. Before we dive into Grace's story, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. Mercy General Hospital rose like a glass cathedral on the east side of the city, its windows reflecting the endless stream of ambulances and desperate families seeking miracles. Inside those sterile walls lived an unspoken truth that everyone accepted, but no one dared challenge. Doctors gave orders. Nurses followed them. That was the hierarchy. Unshakable. Absolute. Grace Sullivan had made peace with her place in that machine. At 28, with gentle hazel eyes and auburn hair she always wore in a practical braid, she'd spent 5 years as a registered nurse on the cardiac surgery floor. She understood the rhythm of healing, the beeping monitors, the whisper of oxygen masks, the weight of someone's life pulsing through an IV line. But she also understood something darker. Her voice, no matter how knowledgeable or experienced, would never carry the same weight as someone wearing a white coat with MD stitched after their name. Still, Grace showed up. Every single day. It was a Thursday night, deep into the graveyard shift when most of the hospital settled into an exhausted hush. Grace was making her final rounds, checking on post-op patients, when she passed room 428. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the crack, she saw only darkness. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out even the hallway light. But she heard something. A faint, labored cough that made her nursing instincts flare like warning bells. She glanced at the patient chart hanging outside the door. J. Morgan. Cholecystectomy. Post-op day 1. No other details. No medical history. No emergency contacts. Just a surgical admission with an unusual note. Patient requests. Minimal staff interaction. Something about that anonymity tugged at her heart. She'd seen too many patients slip through the cracks because nobody took that extra moment to care. Grace knocked softly and pushed the door open. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she whispered into the shadows. "I just want to check your incision site. Post-op infections can develop quickly if we're not careful." A man's voice emerged from the darkness, rougher than she expected. "You're not a doctor, are you?" Grace hesitated. She'd learned to be honest, even when it might work against her. "No, sir. I'm a registered nurse. But if nobody checks your surgical site tonight, you could develop an infection that becomes life-threatening by morning." Silence stretched between them. Then, softer. "Go ahead." By the dim glow of her penlight, Grace carefully examined the incision on his abdomen. Her fingers were gentle, but thorough, checking for heat, swelling, or any signs of infection. She noted his breathing pattern, his skin temperature, the subtle tension in his muscles that suggested he was in more pain than he'd admit. "Everything looks good," she said quietly. "But you're tensing your abdomen. That means you're probably trying to be tough instead of taking your pain medication. That's not bravery, that's just making it harder for your body to heal." The man in the darkness made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You're very direct for someone who isn't supposed to question patients." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't back down. "I've learned that gentle honesty saves more lives than polite silence." She adjusted his IV, noted his vitals in her tablet, and turned to leave. "Rest now. I'll check on you again in a few hours." "Wait." His voice stopped her at the door. "What's your name?" "Grace Sullivan." "Thank you, Grace." She smiled into the darkness, not knowing that the man she'd just cared for was Marcus Bennett, the hospital's newly appointed CEO, hiding his identity to experience Mercy General from the inside. He had no intention of telling her. Not yet. But what happens when the powerless meet the powerful, and neither knows who the other really is? The next morning, fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the staff break room where Grace sat alone, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. In front of her lay a thick folder, 60 pages of research, protocols, and care plans she'd spent 3 months developing. It was a comprehensive post-operative care program for cholecystectomy patients, designed to reduce infection rates and hospital readmissions. She'd studied medical journals, analyzed patient outcomes, consulted with nurses from other hospitals. Every recommendation was backed by research. Every protocol could save lives and money. But when she'd presented it to Dr. Richard Harmon, the chief of surgery, he'd barely glanced past the first page. Nurses document vitals and follow physician orders, he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. Leave treatment protocols to people who actually went to medical school, Miss Sullivan. Now the folder sat in front of her like a monument to wasted effort. Grace blinked back tears, feeling the familiar weight of being invisible despite standing right in front of people. You worked incredibly hard on that. Grace looked up to find Elena Martinez standing in the doorway. At 61, with silver hair and eyes that had witnessed 35 years of hospital politics, Elena was the head of nursing, tough, brilliant, and 3 weeks away from retirement. I thought it could make a real difference, Grace said quietly. But maybe I was overstepping. Elena sat down across from her, her gaze fierce and unwavering. Let me tell you something. I've learned in 3 decades of nursing, the person who sees most clearly is often the one standing in the lowest place. Because from down there, you see what everyone above is missing. What you're doing isn't overstepping. It's courageous. And courage always threatens people who've gotten comfortable with the way things are. Grace managed a weak smile. Courage doesn't feel very useful when nobody's listening. That, Elena said firmly, is about to change. Trust me. What Elena knew but couldn't yet tell Grace was that Marcus Bennett had been watching, and what he'd seen in that dark room had awakened something he thought had died years ago. Faith that good people could still survive in a broken system. Upstairs in the private recovery wing, Marcus sat propped against pillows, his laptop balanced on his knees. He wasn't reviewing budget reports or staff evaluations. He was reading Grace Sullivan's nursing file. 5 years at Mercy General. Exemplary patient satisfaction scores. Multiple commendations for going above and beyond. But also 3 formal complaints from physicians for exceeding nursing scope and questioning physician judgment. Marcus knew those complaints weren't red flags. They were proof of exactly what he'd been searching for. Someone who cared more about patients than politics. He'd taken this job as CEO with one mission: to find out if Mercy General's proclaimed values, patient first, always, actually meant anything beyond marketing slogans. So he'd checked in under an alias, demanded minimal staff contact, and waited to see who would show up when nobody was watching. Most nurses had read his chart, noted his request for privacy, and stayed away. Not Grace. She'd walked into that dark room because her instinct to care overruled every rule telling her to leave him alone. It reminded him of someone he'd lost, a night shift nurse named Sarah, who'd once caught a medication error that would have killed his mother. Sarah had been fired for questioning the attending physician. 2 weeks later, she died in a car accident. Marcus had spent 15 years trying to forgive himself for not fighting harder to protect her. He closed his laptop and stared out the window at the city below. Maybe he couldn't save Sarah, but he could do something for Grace Sullivan. If she survived, what was coming next? That afternoon, chaos shattered the 4th floor. Grace was updating charts when the code alarm shrieked that bone-chilling sound that meant someone was dying. Room 431. Post-operative patient. Blood pressure plummeting. Breathing shallow and rapid. She grabbed the crash cart and sprinted down the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside the room, Dr. Harmon stood frozen, his face pale, his hands shaking as he stared at the monitors. The patient, a 56-year-old woman 2 days post-surgery, was crashing, and Harmon seemed paralyzed by indecision. Grace didn't wait for orders. She'd seen this before. Internal post-operative bleeding, the kind that doesn't show up on monitors until it's almost too late. The abdomen was distended, the skin cool and clammy, classic hemorrhage. She started the protocol. IV fluids wide open. Oxygen increased to maximum. Manual pressure on the abdomen to slow the internal bleeding, while she paged the surgical team stat. "Sullivan! Step back!" Harmon's voice cracked with authority he didn't actually feel. "This isn't your scope. Wait for the attending surgeon." But Grace kept working, her hands steady even as her pulse raced. "She's bleeding internally, Dr. Harmon. If we wait, we'll lose her." "That's not your call to make." Grace looked him directly in the eyes. "Then make it yourself. Right now. Because in 2 minutes, there won't be a choice to make anymore." For a moment, everything hung in terrible balance. Then Harmon stepped back, and Grace took over. The surgical team arrived 4 minutes later and rushed the patient to emergency surgery. They saved her life barely. The surgeon told Grace later that another 5 minutes would have been too late. But instead of gratitude, Grace found herself sitting in a cold administrative office 2 hours later, facing the nursing supervisor, while Dr. Harmon filed his formal complaint. She overstepped her scope, Harmon insisted, his pride clearly wounded. Made critical decisions without physician orders. This is a serious liability issue that could cost this hospital millions if it went wrong. The supervisor, a tired woman named Patricia, who looked like she hadn't slept in a week, turned to Grace. "Is this accurate?" Grace's voice was steady, but her hands trembled in her lap. "I followed emergency protocol for suspected internal hemorrhage. Every action I took was within my nursing scope. That patient would have died if I'd waited for orders that weren't coming." Patricia sighed heavily. "I believe you, Grace. But this is the 3rd time in 2 years that a physician has filed a complaint about you acting independently. I have no choice but to suspend you pending a formal review." The room tilted. Grace felt the floor disappear beneath her. Suspended? For saving someone's life? For acting without physician oversight? Patricia corrected quietly. "I'm sorry. It's 3 days. Pending investigation." Elena appeared in the doorway, summoned to witness the decision. She looked at Grace with an expression Grace couldn't read. Disappointment? Sympathy? Then Elena signed the suspension authorization. Grace felt something inside her crack. Even Elena, her mentor and defender, had signed the paperwork that condemned her. She stood on shaking legs, removed her badge, and placed it on the desk. Then she walked out of Mercy General Hospital, certain her career was over. She had no idea that the man in room 428 had been watching the entire thing unfold, and he was absolutely furious. Marcus Bennett sat in his hospital bed, his laptop open to the hospital's internal security feed. He'd watched the code unfold. Watched Grace Sullivan save a life while a doctor stood frozen. Watched her get punished for having the courage that everyone else lacked. He picked up his phone and made 3 calls. The first was to his assistant. "Schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. Non-negotiable attendance." The second was to the hospital's attorney. "I need the personnel files for Dr. Richard Harmon, Patricia Reynolds, and every complaint ever filed against Grace Sullivan. Tonight." The third call was to Elena Martinez. "You signed that suspension knowing I was watching, didn't you?" Marcus said when Elena answered. "I signed it because Grace needed someone to trust the system one last time before you burned it down," Elena replied calmly. "Sometimes people need to hit bottom before they're ready to rise." Marcus smiled grimly. "Tomorrow morning, everything changes. I'm counting on it," Elena said. "That girl saved your life, even though you were hiding in the dark. Now it's your turn to step into the light." Grace spent her suspension in a fog. 3 days felt like 3 years. She slept poorly, jumped at every phone notification, and replayed that code over and over, wondering what she could have done differently. On the morning of the 3rd day, her phone rang. Unknown number. "Hello? Miss Sullivan. This is Patricia Reynolds. I need you to come to the hospital immediately. There's an emergency board meeting concerning your case." Grace's stomach dropped. This was it. They were going to fire her officially. She dressed carefully, black slacks, white blouse, her hair in that same practical braid. If this was the end of her career, she'd face it with dignity. When she arrived at Mercy General, Patricia was waiting in the lobby. But instead of leading her to HR, Patricia took her to the top floor, the executive wing Grace had never entered before. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, confused. Patricia's expression was unreadable. "You'll see." They entered a massive boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Around a long table sat the hospital's board of directors, the chief of staff, Dr. Harmon, and Elena Martinez. And at the head of the table sat a man Grace had never seen before. Tall, early 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples and intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "Miss Sullivan," he said, standing. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Grace sat, her heart hammering. Who was this man? "I'm Marcus Bennett," he said, "CEO of Mercy General Hospital. And 3 days ago, you saved my life." The room spun. Grace's mind raced back to room 428, to the dark figure she'd cared for, to the voice that had thanked her. "J. Morgan?" "An alias," Marcus confirmed. "I checked into this hospital anonymously because I needed to know if our mission statement, patient first, always was real or just marketing. I needed to experience this place as a vulnerable patient, not an administrator." He walked around the table to stand beside her. "Do you know what I discovered? Most of the staff read my chart, saw that I requested privacy, and left me alone. They followed orders. They stayed in their lane. But you walked into that dark room because you cared more about my safety than my preferences. You saw a patient who needed help, and you helped, even though I was hiding from you." Grace's throat tightened. She didn't know where this was going, but the intensity in his eyes made her pulse race. Marcus turned to address the room. "Then I watched this nurse save a patient's life while a physician stood paralyzed, and I watched her get punished for it." Dr. Harmon shifted uncomfortably. "With respect, Mr. Bennett," Nurse Sullivan acted outside her. "Her scope," Marcus interrupted. "Let's talk about scope, Dr. Harmon. I've spent the past 72 hours reviewing every complaint ever filed against Grace Sullivan. Do you know what I found?" He pulled up a presentation on the screen behind him. 3 complaints, each one filed by a physician. Each one occurred immediately after Miss Sullivan prevented a medical error or complication. In every single case, her actions were clinically sound and potentially life-saving. In every case, she was punished for making someone with more authority feel inadequate. The room was silent. Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Grace Sullivan represents everything we claim to value: clinical excellence, patient advocacy, moral courage. Yet our system has spent 5 years trying to break her spirit for possessing those exact qualities." He turned to the board members. "This isn't just about one nurse. It's about a culture that punishes people for caring too much, for questioning authority, for putting patients above politics. If we suspend Grace Sullivan for saving a life, what message does that send?" Elena spoke up, her voice clear and strong. "It tells every young nurse in this hospital that following your conscience will destroy your career. It tells them to keep their heads down, follow orders, and let patients suffer rather than risk angering a doctor." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. So, here's what's going to happen." He looked directly at Grace. "Your suspension is overturned, effective immediately. You will receive back pay for the 3 days, plus a formal apology from this hospital." Grace's eyes widened in disbelief. "Furthermore," Marcus continued, "we're creating a new position, Director of Nursing Excellence. This person will develop hospital-wide care protocols, train nursing staff, and serve as a bridge between nursing and physician leadership. Grace Sullivan, I'm offering you this position." The room erupted. Dr. Harmon stood up, his face red. "This is outrageous. She's a staff nurse with 5 years' experience. She's not qualified to." "She's more qualified than most of the administrators in this room," Marcus cut him off. "Including you, Dr. Harmon. Which brings me to my next point." Marcus pulled up another document. "I've reviewed your performance as chief of surgery. 3 patient complaints in the past year. 2 near misses that required intervention from nursing staff. And yesterday's incident where you froze during a code while a nurse saved your patient's life. He paused. You're being reassigned to a non-supervisory role, effective immediately. The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus's eyes swept across the board members. This hospital will become what we claim to be. A place where competence matters more than hierarchy. Where speaking up is celebrated, not punished. Where nurses like Grace Sullivan are recognized as the skilled professionals they are. He turned back to Grace, and his expression softened. You showed me that good people can survive in a broken system. Now I'm asking you to help me fix it. Will you accept this position? Grace couldn't speak. Tears streamed down her face. She looked at Elena, who was smiling with obvious pride. Yes, Grace whispered. Then stronger. Yes, I accept. The room applauded most of it anyway. Dr. Harmon stormed out, but Grace barely noticed. She was too busy trying to breathe through the overwhelming wave of emotion crashing over her. For 5 years, she'd felt invisible, powerless, convinced that caring too much would destroy her. And now, the man she'd helped in the darkness had stepped into the light and changed everything. 3 months later, Mercy General Hospital looked the same on the outside, but inside, everything had shifted. Grace stood in the newly renovated training center, facing 30 young nurses who'd gathered for her workshop on patient advocacy and clinical courage. She wore professional attire now, still practical, but with a confidence she'd grown into. Her badge read, Director of Nursing Excellence. Your voice matters, she told them, her tone both gentle and fierce, even when someone with more degrees or more years tells you to stay quiet. Even when questioning authority feels terrifying. Especially then. One young nurse raised her hand. But what if we're wrong? What if we speak up and we're just making things worse? Grace smiled, remembering her own fear. Then you'll learn something valuable. But staying silent when you know something's wrong? That doesn't protect anyone, not you, and definitely not your patients. She shared the story of that code, of standing up to Dr. Harmon, of getting suspended for doing what she knew was right. I thought my career was over, she admitted. I thought courage had destroyed me, but it turned out that the person I'd helped in the dark was watching, and he'd been waiting for someone brave enough to challenge a broken system. The nurses listened with rapt attention, and Grace saw herself reflected in their faces, that mixture of hope and fear, of wanting to make a difference, but being afraid of the cost. After the session, Grace walked through the hospital corridors. They felt different now. Nurses moved with more confidence. Physicians actually stopped to listen when nurses raised concerns. The walls between hierarchy levels were beginning to crumble. Elena had retired last month, but not before pulling Grace aside one final time. You're going to doubt yourself, Elena had said. You're going to wonder if you deserve this. But remember, you earned this position long before Marcus Bennett ever checked into room 428. He just gave you the platform. The courage was always yours. Grace found Marcus in his office, reviewing patient satisfaction surveys. He looked up when she knocked, and his serious expression softened into a smile. The scores are incredible, he said, gesturing to his screen. Infection rates down 18%, patient complaints down 23%, and nursing retention. He shook his head in amazement. We haven't lost a single nurse in 3 months. You're transforming this place. Grace sat down across from him. We're transforming it, she corrected. You took the risk. You challenged the board. You gave up your anonymity to protect me. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Of course. 15 years ago, I was a surgeon. A good one. But I made a mistake, prescribed the wrong medication dosage. A nurse named Sarah caught the error before it killed my mother. She saved my mom's life by questioning my order. His voice grew thick. The attending physician fired her for insubordination. 2 weeks later, Sarah died in a car accident. And I've spent 15 years hating myself for not fighting harder to protect her. Grace's breath caught. Marcus, when I walked into that dark room, he continued, I was testing this hospital, but I was also testing myself. Could I create the kind of place where nurses like Sarah and you don't get punished for being excellent? Could I build something that actually protects the people who protect patients? He looked at her, and Grace saw the weight he'd been carrying. You reminded me why I got into medicine in the first place. Not for the prestige or the power, but because caring for vulnerable people is the most important work in the world. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. Sarah would be proud of what you're building. We're building, Marcus corrected with a small smile. Together. 6 months after that dark night in room 428, Mercy General Hospital hosted its first annual Patient Care Excellence Awards. The auditorium was packed with staff, board members, and local media. Grace stood backstage, her heart racing as she prepared to speak. She'd been asked to present the inaugural Courage in Care Award, an honor that would go to a nurse who demonstrated exceptional patient advocacy. As she waited for her cue, she thought about her journey, about feeling invisible for so many years, about the night she'd walked into a dark room, not knowing that act of kindness would change everything, about the courage it took to keep showing up, keep caring, keep fighting for what was right even when the system pushed back. Marcus approached, looking polished in a dark suit. Nervous? He asked. Terrified, Grace admitted. Public speaking isn't exactly my strength. You're speaking truth to a room full of people who need to hear it, Marcus said. That's not public speaking. That's leadership. He paused, then added more quietly. Elena was right, you know, about you being ready for this before I ever showed up. I just opened a door. You're the one who walked through it and pulled others along behind you. Grace smiled, feeling the weight of his words. We make a good team. The best, Marcus agreed. When Grace's name was called, she walked onto that stage with her head high. She looked out at the audience and saw dozens of nurses, young and experienced, confident and uncertain, all watching her with hope in their eyes. 5 years ago, Grace began, her voice steady, I was suspended for saving a patient's life. I thought my career was over. I thought courage had destroyed me. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. But I learned something crucial. Courage doesn't destroy you. It transforms you. And sometimes, the people you help in the dark become the allies who stand with you in the light. She glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. This award isn't about me, Grace continued. It's about every nurse who's ever been told to stay quiet when they knew something was wrong. Every caregiver who's put patients above politics. Every person who's walked into a dark room because someone needed help, even when nobody was watching. She held up the Crystal Award. We're creating a new culture here. One where caring isn't a liability, it's our greatest strength. Where your voice matters as much as your credentials. Where good people don't just survive in the system, they change it. The auditorium erupted in applause. Grace saw nurses standing, some wiping tears, others smiling with fierce pride. She saw Elena in the front row, her eyes shining, and she saw Marcus, whose expression conveyed everything words couldn't capture. After the ceremony, Grace found a quiet moment in the hospital chapel. She sat in the peaceful silence, thinking about the patient she'd lost years ago, the one whose death had haunted her, whose memory had driven her to never stay silent again. I hope I've honored you, she whispered to the empty room. I hope every life I've saved, every protocol I've changed, every nurse I've inspired, I hope it all means something. She felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. That patient's death hadn't been her failure. It had been her awakening. And everything that followed, the courage, the advocacy, the transformation, had been built on that foundation of loss and love. Grace stood and walked back into the bustling hospital. Nurses greeted her warmly. Physicians actually listened when she spoke. Patients felt safer knowing someone like her was watching over them. She'd spent years feeling invisible, powerless, convinced that being good in a broken system would destroy her. But she'd learned the truth. Goodness doesn't destroy you. Fear does. Silence does. Accepting injustice does. Courage, real courage, transforms everything. And sometimes, the person you help in the darkness becomes the catalyst who changes your entire world. Not because you needed saving, but because they finally saw what you'd been all along: powerful, valuable, essential. Grace Sullivan had never been invisible. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to step into the light, and now she was helping others do the same. Thank you so much for watching Grace's story. If it touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear that their courage matters. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'd love to know, have you ever stood up for what's right, even when it scared you? Drop your story in the comments below, and remember to tell me what city you're watching from. I love seeing our community grow. Until next time, keep being brave, keep being kind, and never let anyone convince you that caring too much is a weakness. See you in the next story.